from 7:30, so we'll make a start. Item 1 on tonight's agenda is to receive apologies for absence. I've actually got an apology from Paul, but he's not here with us. I'm not sure what's happened. Actually, get along later. Item 2 is representation by interested parties. Now, we do have an interested party.
Yes, it is. Yes.
I think probably the way that we'll do it is we'll get the formal bits out of the way. We'll then go to the planning application, which Mr. McDonald was interested in. And I think the way that we can do that is give them a couple of minutes to talk to us, and then we'll do deliberations on that application, and then go back to the meat of it, which I suspect is going to be just off road and Beauty Road all over again. So, declarations of interest in relation to any of the applications, what are the matters on tonight's agenda?
Oh, he's in. Come in.
I'll give you a moment to.
Yeah, obviously, drop off something that fell over, stupid man.
Sign yourself.
You're all right.
You are.
Yeah, I tripped over someone's driveway.
It was dark. Were you checking on the planning? Yeah.
Sorry, Jim.
That's all right. Just relieved you more, please.
Yeah.
We just got to declarations of interest. Are you aware that you have any?
I don't have any, thank you, Jim.
I don't think anybody else has declared any either. So, that moves us on to the minutes of the meeting held on the 5th of October. It's been circulated, present, all of us present tonight, I think. With Councillor Rycock in addition. Somebody want to propose those? Councillor Chester, seconded Councillor Fuller, all those in favour? Bear with me. I'll take it back to, whilst there's a natural break, once we're starting
What's up? What was he telling you about?
I still feel one.
Yeah, you managed to get up there. Was there a reboot? Like your computer, and I thought that was sort of closed me eyes. It's like a computer reboot sequence. Which you don't do.
Right, let's move on to the planning applications. Now, Mr. McDonald is here for what is indeed item 6, which is both a full application and a listed building consent for Monsedos Lane, which is removing an existing failing Western roof slates to the rear elevation, replacing them with Winchcombe roof slates, repairing timbers as necessary. And we have a photograph. Hopefully a useful photograph.
Clearly explains the issue.
Shown there, and there are actually quite a number of photographs on the portal. You just flick through those, so we've got it fixed in our minds.
Is this bit here? Or is this bit?
So which is the roof? Is it with the window?
That's
So, I might as well explain the picture.
Yes, you might as well tell us what we're looking at.
Well, obviously, this information I've got, obviously, here's a great list of building. My understanding is it's only the front facade is listed, not the rear. The front facade has got nice fresco, but the tiles are concrete tiles. It's not Collie Weston at the front where the street aspect is, and people can see it. The back, my understanding, is not listed, but the back is, if an architect, very ugly. I mean, this is you can see here it's treated, it's brick, it's a mess. For some reason, it's still Collie Western. We've had regular leaks with it, and we get it repaired by Collie Western man. We said this last year in August, we fully refurbished all the dormer. We did all the repaired and redid all the ridges. We came down here to see we repaired any potential leak paths, replaced any failed Collie Western things, tiles, and we've got leaks coming, and it's invariably around here, and it's coming through the plaster. Now the problem for us on the inside, you can't see the timbers easily, you can't see what's going on because it's all under the plaster, and most of it is not accessible. The architect has a concern that and she's not blaming it, but the building to the right, which is the pharmacy and the post office, has a long roof which comes down onto the extension. That actually is broken, and one of her fears is during heavy rain, all the water from the main roof is coming onto the extension roof and then down to that gutter. You have a picture of the gutter. And the gutter probably never gets emptied. And the outside sits on this side of it. It's coming from, this is where the pharmacy is. It's this side where it's tracking through. Her concern is the gutter as well. It isn't capable of holding the water, and it could be potential. So water can come off the gutter and cascade down into this area and make it vulnerable. So that is a front fascia. And
I know which one it is.
so part of our issue, this is not directly relating to the planning. Our problem as well is access. We have to go through here. We have to block the road with a scaffolding and get through the back. It's not an easy route to get at. But if you going through here, there's a very small courtyard area. Virtually nobody looks over the back of the building because there's another low building there. There's nobody looking on the back. The back is ugly, and we're having constant problems with it. So our issue is, we've talked to builders, we've talked to architects, and we have put a request in to say, well, particularly with this building to the left, we can't find the leak paths. And if we put Collie Western back on, which hasn't got underfelt, it's using reclaimed tiles, we constantly have a problem. We can't seal it properly. So where we were hoping that we'll be able to, because of those factors, it's at the back, nobody sees it, to get a good fix when we haven't got good access, that we could actually take the Collie Western off, actually get some underfelt on it to give it a chance of really sealing it and protecting the timbers, and replace it with Winchcombe, which are look-alike Collie Western. My understanding from the architect is parts of East Northamptonshire have done that. It has been permitted in certain circumstances to allow that to happen. And so we're saying, we would like to take those off, check all the timbers, make sure they're secure, make sure they're sturdy and solid when everything's off, refelt it, and put back on a look-alike Collie Western. And that will give us a roof which is sealed, and we've got some confidence that the timbers are not being damaged, because currently we've no idea what's happening to the roof because it's hidden under the roof space, or it's up here. Because the roof is there, we can't get into that space easily. So it's a very difficult building to guarantee that we can protect the structure and the timbers. So the fact that my understanding is we're not compromising the planning, because the planning is the front. You look at the back and you can see it's not a delight. And it will give us a stable solution for the future, protecting the building timbers, and say nobody looks at it. The other buildings around this are a mixture of tiles. If you say, well, they're all Collie Western and whatever, those to the right are Collie Western, those are standard tiles, are not Collie Western there. So there's a mixture. So the back is not looked on. There's a mixture of finishes, and as I said, the application was, we thought, try a reasonable one to get a long-term solid fix for the roof. You can't get up here. And I think she's got a picture, that downpipe's broken. And so the owner, Mr. Simmons, if he doesn't get anybody up there, it's difficult to get on, to repair that gutter. It's difficult to empty it because it's so high up. So the risk of heavy rain coming over the gutter, the architect thinks that this it'll easily come pouring off here in the rain and cascading down onto the roof, which isn't helping it either. So we're putting a request to try and get this replaced and stabilised. Hopefully it seems reasonable in the circumstances.
Does anyone have any questions?
What's going to happen to the old tiles?
Well, the roofer, we're planning to use Macrones, and they are Collie Western experts, and they will, when they price it, they offset the Collie Western, and then once they recover, I think
So being reused, essentially.
yeah, he'll reuse them. He reckons he won't get more than 25%.
Are there any plans to do any insulating?
Sorry?
Are there any plans to do any insulating at the same time?
We can get the roof insulated and done a really good job. Yeah. Okay, that's a good point.
That'd be important.
Yeah.
Do we know what the composite makeup of the winch comes on? Do you know what?
I personally don't know. I don't know the real detail. I know it's used regularly. It is the one that's often used as a lookalike for Collie Western or other similar things. It's a modern tile. It's sturdy, it can be replaced easily. No,
I did research as far as I want to research these things on Google, hence it was on the note. These seem to have been introduced in 2016 by a company called Winchcombe Reclamation Limited, who described the tile as being a diminishing concrete tile.
Well, that's like Collie Western.
I'm not quite sure what word diminishing means in this sense, but that's how it's described.
Can I explain to you?
In which case, if you're an expert on diminishing tiles,
Collie Western, they graduated.
Yeah.
yeah,
That's the point.
I see.
So they diminish in size
Yeah.
or grow in size, whichever way you want to.
That makes sense. Right, thank you very much.
Okay. Shall I leave now? Is that the best thing to do or what?
It's,
I mean,
you can stay if you want to listen to them
stay here on
talking.
deliberations. Not just the case, maybe.
I know, I think you've got the background.
Very good, thank you for that, very good.
I'll leave you to your privacy.
We're on camera.
Well, can I get down the door easily? Can I just thought, does it lock?
Yeah, if you look for the janitor, he'll be hanging around and be able to see you out.
Thank you, thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Yes, part of the documentation that accompanied this application was an interesting little extract from when the property was Grade 2 listed. And it was described as late 18th century, 2 stories in an ashlar with modern tile cement roof. Tallies with what we were being told about the roof on what I might call the far side. So far as I'm aware, if a building's listed, I don't think you can list part of a building and not the whole of the building.
That's a bit confusing.
So I think that's slightly misleading. I'm sure, however, it wasn't done with an intent to mislead, but I don't believe that you can have a partially listed building, so to speak, unless our conservation officer effectively tells us otherwise in due course. By coincidence, later on in our agenda, we have a look at our various planning policies. And on our ordinary guidance document, under policies affecting the conservation area, we have the very clear current guidance. Any roof which comprises Collie Western tiles shall only be repaired or replaced using Collie Western tiles. It's about as clear cut as it could get. Now, there have been numerous examples of people attempting to replace Collie Western roofs in the town. The one that I can think of most recently was the gallery, which is what is now Salerno's. And when refurbishment works were done to that to make the upstairs living accommodation, they wanted to try and avoid having to re-roof it extensively in Collie Western, and essentially fell foul of the planners who said no. Collie Weston, it's got to be. And we also have debated about whether the fact that it may not be visible from the public highway is relevant. And the view we took was, no, it isn't. When you're thinking about the conservation area, you're looking at the quality of the building and the materials in the building and the historic nature of the materials in the building when it's listed. And therefore, the mere fact that it is not necessarily on view may not matter, and the fact that, and I can't accept the description by Mr. MacDonald, it's not a particularly lovely looking building from that side, but it, on the face of it, falls foul of our policy. Now, it may well be, for all I know, that the planners will have less issues with it than on the face of it if we apply our usual thinking to it, we would have. I can't say I'm unsympathetic, because clearly they've got a problem, clearly they need to address it, but the question is, in a sense, could they not address it just as well by using, in my term, the real stuff? Replacing, and the way I read the application, I thought that they would reuse any Collie Weston tiles that were reusable, actually on this building, not reuse them on another one, and simply supplement them with Winchcombe tiles, which I have to say, looking at the pictures on Winchcombe's website, look very good. I mean, they are clearly a very passable imitation of the real thing. Councillor Arnold.
Excuse my ignorance of this now, but I presume it's a matter of expense, is it not? What is, I mean, I don't know, what would be
The relative costs I couldn't tell you, but I could say unequivocally that it would cost a lot more to do it in Collie Weston than it would to do it in Winchcombe or anything else for that matter. Collie Weston is about as expensive a roofing material
It's top.
as you get on this planet, certainly.
Okay.
We have an awful lot of Collie Weston roofs within
Yeah, I know.
Andover within the conservation area. Hence, again, our desire not to see the kind of pool weakened by allowing replacements to sort of thin into the wedge argument. Councillor Davies.
Yeah, my limited knowledge of Grade 2 listed buildings, but the point is, it's been made Grade 2 listed for a reason, for a special interest in the town. And obviously, we're talking about the back, but if he's going to do the back, he's going to do the front as well, isn't he?
That's
he'll
not
do-
Collie Weston.
Except that,
Well,
strangely enough,
it
even on the listing, it makes clear that the front roofing
is the concrete.
wasn't the Collie Weston tiles,
Yeah.
it's somehow it's concrete roof.
When you look at it, it's not dissimilar. But again, even so, we don't know, but was there a reason that the front was allowed, but the back wasn't? Again, I don't know.
Can I just
Yes.
pipe up here? My old house is Grade 2 listed,
Yeah.
and it's Collie Weston on the back, but slate on the front. And
Yeah.
apparently, we were led to believe that the front of the roof was replaced before the building was listed.
Okay.
And that's how it
Ah,
sometimes
probably-
happens,
Right,
yeah.
okay.
That would
That's how it happened.
But
Yeah.
It's concrete in 92.
Yeah, so the property is obviously, there's a reason why
Yeah.
that's retained. Is that specific to the roof, or is it specific to something else about that property that we're not privy to?
It's like there
It's
was a
the
line
text,
with Colin, with listing, and so there are things in the town that we actually don't like very much, but unfortunately they were done just
Yeah.
before listing.
I mean, it is the totality of the structure which leads to it being listed or
So,
otherwise. So
so
it's-
how
you can't say
on our
it's
policy?
because necessarily, I suspect, X feature or Y feature.
I would say this is probably not worth very much more discussion given our policy.
Well, I suppose it depends, do we apply our existing policy? Bearing in mind we're going to look at that in a minute, it might be that everybody around this table thinks we should get rid of that policy. But if we apply the policy,
Then no.
we would have to object and say it is contrary to our policy and such like. That's it.
I mean, we can make our lives simple and put the decision with the expert in the field.
Well, to some extent, that's what will happen, because if we object, we are not the arbiters here. NNC will make the decision. They will receive the advice of the conservation officer. And if the conservation officer is less exercised about it than we are, it may very well go through.
Shall we leave it to the conservation?
Well, my view is we should object on the basis of our policy and let the
Yeah.
conservation officer persuade them differently if he thinks that he should.
Then we've done our due diligence.
We've done what we
That's
consent.
And the
That's
message,
why we have a planning policy.
the message we have to give is that we do believe in
We're
that
sympathetic.
policy.
And if you're going to have them, you've really got to apply them consistently. Or there's got to be
I
a
did warn you.
hell of a good reason for departing from it. And I'm not sure that I can think of why one would depart from it,
I did,
notwithstanding the difficulties that they have.
I did suggest it might have a bit of difficulty because of our planning policy.
So I think we will object on the basis of that specific policy that we have.
Yeah.
And see what the final decision is.
Yeah.
Right, which brings us, we'll go back to sort of the order in which they appear, which also takes us back to what might be termed the main upgrade of the night. And it might help if you could get up the Stop Road, St Peter's Road application. There are an awful lot of documents in that, with about 34 or 5 new ones, I think, posted this month, last month. What's also strangely happened is I thought I'd very carefully picked up all my papers for tonight. One of which was to print off what we had said about the application last time. But it seems to have managed somewhere between my paper there, but at least we have it.
It's not this one, it's that one.
No, I hoped it was from the isn't.
Do you want me to print it off, David?
It was actually
There's that on it.
yes. I printed it off very carefully last night, put it with all the rest of the papers, I thought, and it must have fallen out somewhere in the car before I actually managed to bring
It's
it
the
up.
one that says,
But there are innumerable changes in a sense to this document. Hence the fact that on my report, it occupies a page and a half.
it does.
Helpfully, in a sense, the developer did a letter to NNC, which is on the portal, which summarises some of the key changes. And then I've broken them down into the bullet points that I've included in here. So, for example, in terms of highways, one of our issues had been what could be called the traffic calming measures on the junction between St Peter's Road and New Road. We didn't much like those because you could see traffic building up effectively right outside existing residential properties on St Peter's Road. Couldn't really see that that was a good idea. That's gone completely. We and others worried about, in effect, there being a rat run through the development so that people could get from Cotterstock Road through to St Peter's Road, New Road, out in effect into the 605 in one direction, or of course doing it in the opposite direction. The developer has changed things in a sense saying, well, I'm trying to make it somewhat more circuitous so that it isn't so attractive to do it as a run. But the reality is, thanks, trying to be more efficient. The reality is you can still do it. It is still not that difficult to drive from Cotterstock Road and out the other end into St Peter's Road. And that was one of the points we made before. Of course, it's also fair to say that another point that we made before was, well, you can't use the St Peter's Road planned access and egress because you have to cross land owned by local town council. We have absolutely no intention of either saying it to you or doing the rights over it. That is in our original document. That has been raised with NNC planning. Raised, I think, by the mayor, or the clerk, I can't remember the name of that. NNC Planning came back and said, it's not planning ground, we're not interested. It's plainly ridiculous. If there was no question of there being an access, you would not have granted planning permission or outline planning permission for 130 houses on that side with only one way in and out onto Cotterstock Road. Or at least, I'd like to think you wouldn't, bearing in mind what they've done on St Christopher's Drive, of course, maybe they would have done anyway. But it doesn't look to me as if we're going to have any joy out of NNC in terms of that point that we made. So they are going to assume that there is the access, and it becomes a private battle between OGC and developer over that, which in place it could end up in the courts, and hence I'm proposed to say precisely nothing more about it at this stage. But in terms of meeting our concern and the concerns of others about the rat run nature of the thing, it doesn't. That's the first point. They have increased the number of parking spaces to beyond the requirements specified by highways. I draw your attention to the fact that that therefore has provision for 326 vehicles. Just let that figure sink in for a moment. 326 vehicles. If anybody is that familiar with St Peter's Road and envisages even half of them trying to go up and down that road, doing a slalom between the parked cars, particularly on days when the Rugby Club is in operation, it just doesn't bear thinking about. But there you are. On past form, I have to say, I have no great faith that highways will regard it as a problem, because highways never regard anything that happens in London as a problem. We can see it's a problem. It's a massive
would be interesting.
but there you are. Another point about all of this is the construction management plan. Construction management plan, when they were originally consulting, was that all the construction traffic would enter not through the residential development, but off Cotterstock Road. Once they applied for the reserved matters, they reversed that and want all the construction traffic to go up and down St Peter's Road. Presumably slaloming in between the parked cars that are there. Whether some vehicles would even be able to get up and down that road with the current quantity of parking, I have to say is doubtful. But nevertheless, that is the proposed access. That again was something we objected to before. I assume we're not going to have changed our minds in the intervening period. So far so bad, I'll give. House types and materials, they do appear to have listened a little bit both to us and others. We felt that it was a little uninspiring, shall we say, that there wasn't the variety, and they've now said they'll introduce 4 new house types into the equation, and they've indicated they'll incorporate some features to try and make them look a little bit different and distinctive, which is fine as far as it goes. The housing mix, I've put the figures in this report to show how they've changed it very marginally to actually create a couple of 1-bed, 2-person maisonette units, there having not been previous provision for those, for bungalows and so on. So far as I can recollect, I don't think that when we first looked at this, we made any specific comments about the housing mix.
40% socially affordable housing included within development.
Yeah. But beyond that, and actually they're not far off those figures when you look at it. Not far off, maybe not there. So maybe we could reiterate that. Open space, essentially they say to create a bit more. They've tried to create some kind of sight lines to make it easier to see from the development through to St Peter's and maybe even across the development through to St Peter's. Something that actually we always regarded as pretty important, that the views of St Peter's were not impacted. In a minute, we'll put up one of the plans. There's a house type, for example. I'll come and show you one of the plan I think we ought to put up in due course. They're also going to introduce some grass verges and put some trees in it, which again will make
Makes that bit
a
wide.
little bit kind of
I saw that.
more natural and so on. And they seem to have done some work with the tree officer on planning. They're introducing something called a trim trail. I couldn't actually find what a trim trail actually was. For informal use along the public right of way running through the development.
It's like an obstacle course.
Is it? I see.
We do some minor exercises on like that.
Right.
Oh, that's what
That I think is,
positive.
if you were looking at the site from St Peter's Road, at the sort of extreme right-hand end is an area of greenland which has also got the sites on it. And I think that UF1 footpath runs to the right of that in a sense. And I think the idea is somewhere between those two there is going to be this area available. I might just have lost the will to work out whether in fact they've incorporated our idea of some recreational space with a sort of a proper play area in it. There is reference to the.
Yes, there.
It's definitely there.
Is that the original or is that the new? Is that
That's the new one.
There is a new bit somewhere, which we might just want to take a look at in a minute.
There we go.
So
There's the leap, or that what it's called, LEP.
Well, not right.
LEAP,
It's that one with the sort of path, like a Y. It's like a Y. No, left. In the middle,
Oh, yeah.
down,
Uh,
fire.
That's a play area, is it?
So is that the trim trail, the one above?
no, trim trail is, if you look to the extreme right,
Yeah. The one that runs down to the rugby club. That footpath's already there, isn't it?
there's an existing public right of way.
Yeah.
Walk from Anglop to Cotterstock. Sort of broadly alongside the river, some of the way and so on. We'll come back to that. But I couldn't actually work out, maybe because I just couldn't bear spending any more time looking at it,
No.
what they were doing with play equipment, if anything. Interestingly enough, in relation to the public rights of way, they said there'd be no impact upon the footpath once the works are complete. You may recall that one of the things we said was we don't actually interfering with the right of way during the construction phase. There are no assurances in that regard, and indeed the way the darn thing is written, it suggests that they fully anticipate that they are going to effectively stop up that public right of way during at least some of the construction phase. They're moving one or two of the things around, including the location of the self-build plots. To the top end of the site, it's now slightly disappeared off there.
Sorry, my fault. I'm trying to view
If you could come back again and just
Sorry.
move it down a bit.
Mouse is not behaving, is it?
It's sort of ultra sensitive.
Right, there you go. So along that northern boundary, you'll see there's a gap between the housing and the sort of dark grey bit above. Of course, within the dark grey bit above is the water treatment facility, sewerage works. And what they've said is that they move things, in essence, as far away from there as they can, and they say that they're satisfied that not a single property will be affected either in the property or in their gardens by odour nuisance. I hate to do this to you. Try to just move it again, move it the other way for a moment. I'm just going to give you move it so that this bit goes up, and so we see St Peter's Road. Right.
Yeah.
Can you smell it?
This is St Peter's Road
Oh,
here.
that's the bit of land we owned.
And that is where I used to live. There is the sewage works up there.
Did you
There were
smell it?
certainly times
Yeah.
when, if you went outside, you could certainly notice that there was a sewerage works in the vicinity. Wasn't constant or anything like constant, but if it's affecting that property, it is sure as hell going to affect those properties. Anyway, according to the developer, no, it isn't.
I've done a
Say,
survey.
in my view, call the other one, and I don't care what expert evidence they've got, it just wouldn't tally with my own experience. And they've done some stuff on the construction management plan as well. Of which one of the things that struck me about it was that although they say, as these things always do, we'll keep noise nuisance to a minimum, etc. There is nothing in there about actually a noise limit. There's nothing in there about how they're going to monitor the noise nuisance. And in relation to the St Christopher's Drive development, which we were looking at only the other week, one of the comments that came back from NNC about their construction management plan was that they didn't like it because there was nothing in there about imposing actual limits on the noise and all the rest of it. So essentially developers don't learn because this one simply replicated what that one did, which in your view is clearly not enough. Just before I came out, I realised that Councillor Clark had emailed me, and I suspect it was you, a document headed residence issues raised about the redesign.
Oh, yes.
Now, I'm going to get you to do it again. Can you pull it up so we can see the bottom of it again?
Yes, it was a.
Yeah, it was emailed, I think, today. Right.
So,
Not on this plan, but on certain other plans, the boundary, not the whole way up, but from about there
oh, that's right.
down there, has the words exact boundary to be established.
Yeah, I saw that.
Now, it's very interesting. When I lived,
Yeah, it does.
there was a hawthorn hedge.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Sorry, there was a hawthorn hedge along here when I was living
Yeah,
there. And essentially, it was quite a lot of natural hedging all the way along. A lot of people had put gateways, and they used to go into the back here. Peak Grange next to us had that under very nice cultivation, and it was used in effect as a right of way so that you could walk all the way around there, enjoy the footpath and so on without having to get messy crossing the field. It's bizarre that they talked about having to establish the boundary because it was a very, very clear boundary. But the only place there isn't a clear boundary now is in my own house, because the people who bought it grubbed off the entire hawthorn hedge. I'm not quite sure now what there is there. We need to look at it for a while. But it is slightly worrying that they describe that as a boundary to be established in my view.
And yet they don't mention the gap, exact boundary to be confirmed.
Yes, the boundary to be confirmed also applies to the bit of land that we maintain as owned by OTC, which they would have to cross in order to use that access of St Peter's Road.
Sorry, where exactly is that piece of land?
Okay.
Yeah. So there's, so if you go down to
This is St Peter's Road.
Yeah.
25.
Yeah.
It goes along the flat down here, and then this is up a quite steep hill. So this is
Then it
the,
stops.
That's like
this
hedges.
is the road, and at the moment,
No,
the
no,
roadway
it's a
stops
big
about
strip,
here. And there is an area of scrub
And a ditch.
and a big,
Yeah.
and a big tree. just there.
Okay.
And it was that piece of land that we believe is actually vested in the town council as the successor to the urban district council.
Okay. Thank you.
Actually, I sat down with you. One of the other things that we mention, and a lot of people have picked up on, you will notice the houses along here. There aren't that many of them. That's because most of these have a double plot. If you count out the number of houses from there to there, I think it's 17, against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's almost double the number just across. A lot of the people who live here, perhaps not too surprisingly, are saying these should be further into the site and further away from us because they're just all too close. And we're concerned about the density. And we did raise an issue around the density along that boundary, saying that, you know, it ought to be more consistent with what's on this side. You're going to put some bigger houses, for example, in the development, put them there, arguably. Although doubtless you could have a similar argument on the extreme left-hand side. Of course, you've got David Webb's property, which is the one right on the corner there, and other big houses on that stretch of Cotterstock Road. And of course, they too now back onto a fairly dense development. In terms of density, they say that it's 30 dwellings per hectare, which is about, what I might call industry standard, I guess. But whether it's right for here, it's another matter. Residents in on some of those Cotterstock Road properties make a similar point about, well, they used to access the field and so on. And they're worried, therefore, about the having gained access rights and so on. Now, you could argue that's the private argument of each of those householders to maintain that their properties have the benefit of informal rights and so on. We certainly observed at an earlier stage that one way around that would be to ensure that there was in effect, a footpath all the way along there. Doesn't need to be a made-up footpath, but in effect, a space which would recognise what has in practice been the situation. And I lived in that house for 30 years, so I should know kind of thing. Residents, I think in Cotterstock Road in particular, worry about changes to the actual roadway there, and certain highways issues which weren't things we particularly picked up on before. Still some issues about the traffic calming generally on the site, question mark about how present access will work with St Peter's Road in the absence of the traffic calming. They've suggested that they're not showing the correct route of UF1, the footpath that then runs on through the rugby club land. An issue around a tree, specific tree.
Some flooding.
A lot of concern still around flooding. To my knowledge, there are springs that pop up there. It can get very waterlogged, albeit that it's a very steeply sloping site, so of course the water simply tends to run down towards the river, not naturally. Some of the properties in St Peter's Road, existing ones, have had to be piled because of subsidence issues.
Yes.
And a lot of the owners there are very worried that the development work here will displace water and cause problems for them. In 1986, I really show my age on this council. In 1986, we had the draft annual local plan. Nothing changes. We still have draft plans 40 odd years later. And when that was done, Anglian Water at that time said, can't develop that field because of all the nasty strained underwater water flows. So we don't think it's suitable for residential development. That just seems to have been swept under the carpet by everybody, including Anglian Water. But the residents are worried. But of course, the paperwork all says we've got it all under firm control.
Those new houses will just go through cracks after years. So,
I have a fear that there will be some serious issues on that side, but there you go. So issues around drainage, etc. Some worry about the impact of the street lighting on existing properties. Again, some issues around the construction management plan, more to do with, okay, if there's a problem, where do we go, who do we report it to, what happens, etc. On the St Christopher's Drive site, they were NNC raised similar issues actually and said, it isn't good enough, there has to be somebody available throughout the operating hours who residents can go to if there's a problem and report it, and so it can be immediately actioned instead of them rummaging around to figure out who they can talk to and probably talk to called handler in India or something to get it looked at. Some concern about how these properties are going to be heated, whether or not any gas boilers are going to be used. Perhaps not unusually, a comment the development should not be taking place at all, as being forced on us. The infrastructure isn't up to it and the rest of it. In a sense, relatively predictable comments from the local community most affected by it, some of which are clearly reflected in what we said in relation to the original one. And I guess the thing is, to what extent we refer back to our original document and simply supplement it. It seems little point in repeating ourselves at length. One of the other points that we made, we've talked about site access, we've talked about infrastructure issues, we've talked about the odour nuisance, we've talked about nuisance from construction in terms of the construction management plan. We've touched on the impact on existing dwellings, St Peter's Road and Cotterstock Road, touched on issues of housing design and materials, social affordable housing. We haven't mentioned the contribution towards schooling issues and future-proof issues there, and perhaps the other key one that we mentioned here and isn't touched on at all, because nobody wants to recognise that roughly half that site lies in Blackthorn Parish. And of course, we made the point where somewhere up in the ground, you've got to be able to work out where one parish is and when ends the other one starts. This does absolutely nothing to do that. I mean, to all intents and purposes, anybody looking at that development can say the whole thing is in harmony, even though somebody isn't. Now, there may or may not be a boundary review in the fullness of time, and probably at that point, I'm still sitting on both councils, and I'll just absent myself in the room on the basis that I'll be conflicted in both directions. I think that it is actually a practical issue. The planners may say it's not a planning issue, but whenever we raise a problem about anything, half the time it tells us it's not a planning issue, it's not something you can do, or there's always some good reason why not. I'll run through it at some length, but it struck me that whilst there are improvements, and we should acknowledge those, they don't deal with everything. That's the problem.
Am I right in saying that apart from, what you'd expect, the two main things from my perspective are the traffic for the the side traffic coming in, not off Cosstock Road. I think that's rather an important issue. And the boundary on the, which we talked about at extent, between the existing houses and the new houses. I mean, everything else is sort of expected, but I think if we're going to reply, in my view, those two need to be flagged up as, if other people agree, I think they're two very key points.
Other thoughts? Councillor?
Yeah, just one thing, I went through this, the other day when I had a day off, I went through quite a lot of the stuff, it was really interesting, it was my first time sort of doing that. And one thing I noticed was the biodiversity report was actually really interesting, because it seems like the building company have not really taken much notice, actually, of the report itself. In the report, there's a lot of talk about how lots of different types of species, lots of different types of animals are affected by, or we use that land quite a lot, especially badgers and reasonably rare bats, things like that. And the most that I seem to find in I think it was the amended construction management plan was talking about how I will have street lights that sort of don't attract too many moths, so bats aren't, and I sort of thought it was it wasn't very good, really, from the. I guess I just like it noted that that their own biodiversity report leaves a lot to be looked at in terms of the actual building development in the area. That's it. Also, I thought it was where you were saying about the sewage plant. I think at the top of that thing, I won't ask you to.
No, you're
Moving.
okay, that's fine.
I'm pretty sure. So if you look in the top left, those are most of the affordable housing. And I thought it was quite interesting that they were nearest the sewage line.
Yes, yeah, it doesn't really require comment, does it?
No. So that's they're my thoughts.
Councillor Davis.
Yeah, mine is really probably around a little bit of the highways, a little bit around the primary school. So they're seeking to move the 30 mile an hour speed limit sign further out around the corner. The entrance to the sign at the top left, off Cosstock Road, that's on a bend. There'll be an expectation that I suspect they'll be hoping that parents will walk their children to the primary school. I can tell you now that will not happen. This week we've had the rear gate shut because of trees coming down on and around the school site, and as a result the Blackthorn Road gate being shut. Cosstock Road was horrendous yesterday. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that construction traffic and activity won't go there at peak times when kids are going to school. And that gate opens at school about 8:30 for the kiss and drop. Parents are allowed on the site to drop the kids off walking in on Cosstock Road, and the same applies at night. And it's not just at 20 past 3 till 4:44, it's at 4:30, and it's any other times. And there are also external clubs that use the school site. So the school is an extended business premises as such. And I think we're kidding ourselves if they think that construction workers will comply with any rules that are given.
I'll just quote you from the construction management plan. The developer has stated that every effort will be made to prevent construction vehicles arriving at or leaving the site between 0800 and 0930 and 1500 and 1630 in order to avoid issues around us.
Takes one
Every
time.
effort, please don't do it.
We're back to that.
Can I do?
They can impose restrictions on the hours in which construction work takes place, but they could also literally impose restrictions to back that up and say, right, you won't use every effort to do it, it won't happen. You will not have traffic movements at those times. Because if they recognise there's an issue, then we might as well make it formal and say it just will not happen. Not, we'll just use every effort to avoid it, because what does every effort mean? What happens if it's consistently broken by it? So, yeah, I'm going to take authority entirely, Councillor Davis, on that. Perhaps we could seek to emphasise it. Lisa, can I just ask, what's the return date on this? Have we got a little bit longer than tomorrow? Because usually I end up coming home from these meetings and then sitting up till about midnight drafting something.
15th of November.
15th, good.
Week Monday.
So that gives me a little bit of time to perhaps put something together and circulate it, which is a help. So, Councillor Jones, we seem to be just working our way along.
So I have nothing else.
Oh, that's very helpful.
I haven't got anything.
And you've nothing to add either. Oh, well, that suddenly truncated that discussion a little bit. Well, would councillors be happy if we used our original comments and referred everybody to these and then said, here are our kind of modifications to supplements to this, given the new, and then I'll try and put something together over the next week or so, get it round to everybody, and say if you've got any issues with it.
So I just ask you, but in the original, did they do sort of noise level report? I remember a lot in the.
As far as I can tell, the answer is no, hence my point earlier, that whilst they say something like every effort will be made to keep noise levels to a minimum, but you will get different varying noise issues on site depending on what's happening at any one time. There's literally nothing in there about absolute limits, and there's nothing in there about how it's going to be monitored.
Yeah, so they're not essentially obliged to.
But they could be.
Right. Okay.
And the planning department could insist, in fact, as part of the whole permission, that there is a construction management plan which provides for X, Y, and Z.
Okay.
So it's perfectly reasonable for us to say things like, no, we won't use any effort to, you will actually not have movements in and out between these hours at all, or whatever it is. Of course, the reality is that if you restrict them, so there's no movement between 8 and 9:30, and the site theoretically starts at 8 o'clock. They're going to have to get their logistical caps on to figure out how they are going to do this. Because we also don't want them doing it at 6 a.m. in the morning to say, oh, well, we've avoided 8 at night. But it might impact upon how quickly that site could actually be developed, because it might narrow the window.
Exactly. And also they say in their, I remember definitely reading it, that they said they're going to be working on Saturday mornings.
Saturday mornings, it's fairly common, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m.
Right. Okay.
I think they won't have any problem in that.
Right. Okay.
That seems to be part of the course.
Right.
All days, Saturdays would tend to be a no-no. Sundays are always a no-no, as our bank holidays. Unless there's anything else, bearing in mind it's already 8:30. There's actually quite a bit on this agenda if we're going to try and do everything. I'm going to suggest we move on to look at the next application, which we can probably look at in a very short order. This one there's a certain of deja vu about all of this, as you will discover. I mean, we spent a long time talking about this development, which we spent a long time talking about in the past. Well, this application has been before us before in its original form. Then there was a previous application to vary condition 3 to alter the external appearance. And now there is an amendment in effect to the application to vary condition 3. And looking at it, and I may have got this entirely wrong, but as far as I could see from looking at the paperwork, I think what they're doing is what was at one point going to be a window now appears to be sliding and folding doors on the southern elevation. I wouldn't think that we would have any particular issues about that change.
No.
I think it's probably just a more no comment than a no objection.
That was easy.
That was easy. The next one is less easy. But on the sense of deja vu, you'll think, you've done this one as well. 20 West Street. West Street is the ship. And you may recall that not that long ago we were looking at the application because the ship, for economic reasons, wanted to get rid of its residential letting accommodation because they didn't have facilities for suites, etc. They were impacted by COVID. You may remember all the arguments. And they wanted to, in a sense, convert this part of their property into a residential unit. And we said, hang on a minute, there is no parking provision whatsoever associated with this, and we objected. It would appear that the owners became aware that we had objected on that basis because they'd come back and they've magicked up 2 parking spaces on their existing land. Because of course the ship has quite extensive land and quite a lot of areas in which people can park. And the plan is that they will in effect designate part of their existing land to create 2 parking spaces. As this is a 3-bedroomed residential conversion, 2 parking spaces would seem to fit highways' normal minimum parking level requirements and would seem at a stroke to get rid of the reason that we weren't happy, because we didn't have any other issues with what was being proposed. Therefore, I suppose if we are going to be consistent and we are satisfied that they now found some parking provision, I suspect the answer would be that we would no longer object and we should say so.
That was the
Nobody
answer.
disagrees.
No, I agree.
No,
That's where we were, you see. That's nice to see.
Well, yes, somebody listened to us. It wasn't an MC, but somebody listened to it. This one's easier. We have 2 tree applications. I think actually they might appear on my list the other way around. Yes. Actually, I'm slightly confused because I thought it was 48 and 46 Breed Road, and I see that we got it down as 48 and 22. So 22 or possibly 46, depending on who's got it right. Tree works to a single tree, and this is a reduction by 2 metres, as it puts it, to previous dimensions to prevent failure of the regrowth in storm conditions. This is tree husbandry.
Yeah, tree officer.
And if we're going to apply our planning policies to that, we would normally object, unless the tree officer gets exercised by it, which I can't imagine for a second he will be. So my suggestion would be that that will be a no objection from us.
I agree. Tree officer.
But the next one,
Creed Road, is it?
is in Creed Road, again. And this one is various tree works to 4 ash trees. And broadly speaking, 3 are to do with effecting reductions, in a sense, to stop failures. But 1 is to fell to ground level due to what is described as large inclusion in lower union and replanting of different species on the northern boundary. I guess if we were again to apply our usual policies, we would presumably not object to the tree husbandry aspects, but in relation to the felling, we would wish to defer to the tree officer who'd rather see an ash tree felled unless it's absolutely necessary and appropriate. But if it is suffering from ash dieback or some other problem, which means it's appropriate to remove it, then I suppose we should be thankful that they are going to replant something instead. Anybody got any?
No, I think it's what we said before.
Yeah. So, no objection, save in relation to, which one is it, T2, where we would prefer not to fell unless the officer thinks it's necessary, something in those lines. And happily, that dispenses with the applications, because there weren't that many of them. It's just that a couple of them were a little complicated. I could also hardly believe it when I looked at the planning outcomes bit, if only because normally we get quite a long list of things which they haven't dealt with since we last met, and in this one, there was 1 application which we didn't object to, and which they granted, so there's not a lot to exercises there. There are no planning appeals. Now, the next item on the agenda is to review the planning guidance and policy documents, to which we seem to have made reference on a number of occasions today. But there are, frankly, a lot of them. We started off with a planning document, which you will notice described as version 2, 2019. So there was an earlier iteration of this. In that earlier iteration, as I remember it, amongst other things, there was reference to the Amble Relief Road, the road which was suggested might run from Benfield Road underground and back around or between Amble and Blackthorn and sort of come out somewhere and so on, and was eventually removed on the basis that it was going to cost so many millions that it was a completely unrealistic view to have. But other changes were no doubt made at the same time, but I can't remember necessarily the detail. But this, of course, is 2019. It's at a time when we had a neighbourhood plan in preparation. It predates where we are currently with the local plan part 2, which is that it exists and it's gone off for elimination and waiting. So there is that document, which is broken down into a bit about residential areas and large developments. There's quite a bit in small and single developments and general matters, and community infrastructure requirements, a bit about trees. So there's that document. There's policies affecting the conservation area, which is part of it, and then bits around employment areas and retail areas. So there's quite a lot. And then there are a whole series of what I might call almost mini policies, ranging from a view on retrospective planning applications to a view on reconsidering previous responses to applications, to a policy on the removal of graffiti, a policy on A-boards and other structures on the highway, a policy on the fly posting, perhaps a theme is emerging there, the policy on illuminated signs in the conservation My guess would be that if we were going to look at changing anything, it's even more likely that we would look at, I'm going to call the main document rather than those small subsidiary ones. But I'm more than open for a discussion about any of those policies and any changes if somebody looked at them and thought we should really be looking at those again. And I suppose one could also say if anybody thinks that we haven't got a policy in an area that perhaps we should have, then maybe we should look at that. But if we're just going to concentrate on that, as I say, I'm open to suggestions. The first obvious change is that in the introduction it says Angle Town Council has no planning powers, but it is a statutory consultee in response to the local planning authority to Cambridgeshire Council.
Yeah.
So within the first two lines, there is a change that would basically need to be made, simply to refer to A and C, rather than practical change is not different. However, it then goes on to talk about the draft Angle neighbourhood plan. The draft Angle neighbourhood plan is dead in the water. So the reference to that should go. But the design statement exists. And arguably, we should still be referring to that design statement. Now, it's quite a big piece of work that was largely done by Mark Benz alongside the neighbourhood planning. And that could be a whole new discussion area at some point. Then you look at what it says about large developments, and the first thing is about infrastructure. It basically says we should be looking at infrastructure issues, and it sets out all of these things that we think really need to be taken into account. I'd be surprised if our view on that's changed in any meaningful fashion. There is then a bit about landscape setting, which in the context of the application we were looking at earlier might be relevant. It says any development proposed for Angle should take into account the town's location in the Nene Valley and should therefore be sensitive to and have the effect of enhancing key views and vistas from the Nene Valley. Recall what I said earlier in relation to the new development about trying to provide sightlines, for example, through to St Peter's Church. And it says, not only enhancing views and vistas, especially of the church spire. So you really get the feeling maybe the developers actually planned our policy and thought, I know a way of getting Angle Town Council on side, I'll do something absolutely in line with it. Any development should be located and designed in such a way as to be sensitive to the town's landscape setting, retaining and enhancing the distinctive qualities of the landscape character in which it would be situated or from which it would be viewed. And then we said, we value the views of and into Angle, both from the road and from the River Nene itself, and wish, so far as is practical, to preserve these views from residential or other development. Frankly, that was a nudge towards, we don't want a particular site that has outline planning permission, which we've just been looking at, to be developed at all. We may still take the view that we would want to retain that language, albeit that we kind of lost that part of the argument. It then says that in allocating or considering sites for development priority, it should be given to the reuse of suitable previously developed land and buildings in line with national policy and the national planning policy framework. Wherever possible, development should take place within the existing settlement boundaries of the town, rather than building on greenfield sites. Oops, oh dear. Beyond the existing settlement boundaries and or toward the River Nene. Oops. It has to be said they might have taken the bit on about spires, but I don't think anybody else our document. Any development should take place where it is likely to have the least visual impact, particularly on and from the river, as this is one of Angle's greatest assets. By now I'm beginning to weep, because it seems to me that their final words, but in terms of preventing what has happened subsequently, they just haven't worked. It then also said if there is to be any further development of either Ashton Road or Herne Road, consideration should be given to the construction of another access from and to the A605 and bypass. And we know that outline planning permission has been granted for a development in that area which does not rely upon any form of additional access onto the A605. And sadly, it would seem as if that has gone for a burden. And again, you may feel that we are actually going to have to look at rejigging some of this because there's no point in saying that anymore, I suspect. Then we talked about Oundle being suitable to small-scale developments rather than large estates. I don't think we define small-scale in this, but I think we would recognise that the one we just been looking at on any real sort of conception of it is a large estate. So again, despite what we say, we haven't really got what we wanted. Oundle is suitable to small-scale developments rather than large estates, as such development would be more in tune with the way in which the town grew and fast around courtyards and back lanes, and developments which adopt such layouts so far as they are consistent with safety and security would be reflective of the town's heritage and more likely to be supported. There should, however, be no presumption that developments over a certain size should not be supported. Applications for large developments should be judged on their own merits, just as all other applications should be so judged. And I suspect we would still want to say pretty much that. We then talk about small and single developments, saying we may not support planning applications to extend existing small houses on the grounds that the stock or supposedly more affordable housing is thereby diminished. We've had that conversation in this room before, particularly on estates where planning permission was originally granted on the basis that a suitable balance had been struck between larger and smaller properties.
Yeah, that's enough.
Councillors may recall that in that document we suggested that if it was possible, it should be built into the planning consent and the reserved matter state. It won't be, of course, but
At least we're pushing it down.
we then said we might not support applications to convert garages into living accommodation if the result of so doing would be likely to lead to on-street parking as opposed to off-street parking. We will require adequate on-site parking for all residential developments, as we don't wish to add to existing pressures within the town by additional parking on the roads. We don't specifically refer to the highways department's guidelines, which seem to be being followed pretty much by the planners actually. We may not support planning applications to build an additional dwelling or dwellings within the curtilage of an existing dwelling if this would unbalance the street scene. I could draw your attention to the plan that we just looked at, which showed St Peter's Road. In between two of the houses on that side of the road where I said, oh look, there's 8 houses down here and there are now 17. Actually, it's not true. There are now 9 houses since that aerial shot was taken. A house has been built between where I used to live and Paul Cottage next door. And it's jammed in, and if anybody's ever driven down that road, just look at that property and you will see what I mean about unbalancing street scenes. We objected and we lost the argument. And if you want another example of planning going wrong, look at the property on the other side,
Opposites on the road.
where the very small property is now an elephant on a pea and looks utterly out of place. I still think we should maintain the policy possible. Then we said, essentially, we defer to ambient water on issues around drainage, etc. And we said this: we would not approve of residential development being built closer to the sewage plant than the existing housing stock unless the plant can be improved to ensure that smells no longer emanate from it.
I didn't read that.
Yet again,
Yes.
we have been snookered. And one would have to look at that and say, I wonder whether we will have to rethink that. And we know why it was there. It was because we had a feeling that the development of that site was not ideal, and that was one of the reasons as well why, when we looked at it in our own neighbourhood plan, at the time we had a very restricted development that had 30 properties on what might be called the top end. but there we are. Then we said we defer to the local education authority about education issues. I think at that point we hadn't contemplated the interesting issue of the background primary schools' relationship to development, but there you go. We deferred to health professionals similarly, and we went on. We said the architectural characteristics of any new development should be of a high quality and appropriate to their setting and should take into account the provisions of the design statement. If such developments are located within or directly adjacent to the town centre conservation area, they should be constructed of local stone and slate so as to be in keeping with neighbouring buildings. Since large-scale developments with added to town parking pressures, any planning application for such developments should ensure adequate on-site parking is provided. Then we said developers should contribute adequately, and we looked at that. And we talked about the community infrastructure requirements. And we said these were improvements to the flow of pedestrians and vehicular traffic in the town centre, improvements to an expansion of car parking provision, both in the town centre and outside it, construction of trails, walkways or cycleways around the town to provide for the well-being of residents and to develop opportunities for tourism, expansion of the cemetery and allotment provision in the town. I should have said actually, in relation to the St Peter's Road, Cottesdale Road bit, that on that plan, in what might be termed broadly the bottom right-hand corner of it, is reference to allotments with question mark. We shall see. It is part of our, sorry, I haven't quite finished. The provision of a large community space suitable for use as a festival site. That, of course, is tied pretty largely to our views around a development north of Benfield Road, which was incorporated into our neighbourhood plan and which featured a large central festival site, or large green area suitable for festival use. Provision of new or enhanced facilities for sport and recreation. Of course, since then we've now seen the extraordinary new buildings up at Alnwood School, which seem to me to replicate the best Olympic villages probably that have ever been seen. And it's right here in Alnwood and publicly accessible. Quite extraordinary. Alnwood Town Council is not willing to adopt further open spaces and or play equipment on new developments due to the long-term financial impact of this upon the council. So there it is spelled out. We had that debate only the other week. Alnwood Town Council will seek alternative provision of pitches, etc. in the event of any development affecting any of the existing sporting facilities within the town. Will not promote the development of those within the ownership of the council for non-sporting or recreational use. So that's the recreation ground, the rugby pitch, tennis club, etc., which we do. Alnwood Town Council would oppose development on important green spaces within the town, including the Chapel Gardens and Fletton Field. Then there's a bit about trees, which basically talks about tree husbandry and tree felling. And then we have policies around the conservation area, and they deal with solar panels, internally illuminated signs, externally illuminated signs, changes to shop fronts, and yes, roofing materials. And then there's bits about employment areas and so on. It's clear, isn't it, that that document needs a degree of revision. What I would suggest that perhaps we do is that I will do a certain amount of work on making changes to it, and then we'll bring it back and we'll look at it hopefully next month, if we can't do it next month, as soon as practical. I rather suspect that we may feel, particularly in the week of COP26, that in terms of talking about new developments, we might also want to include something about green standards, particularly perhaps regarding promoting things like heat pumps and solar panels and this, that, and the other.
Solar panel.
So
Green trawls.
I think that document will need a bit of looking at it. it is an internal document, it has no obviously legal binding effect, but it is simply there for our own benefit to help us when we're looking at planning applications, say, have we actually come to a view about this, and so what is it? And there are certain things in there which this committee, if you like, has reminded full council from time to time. It's probably therefore going to be appropriate when we adopt a new version of that, or wish to, that actually the planning committee says, as a recommendation to full council, this is what we are looking to do, and just ask them to endorse it. I think it would be surprising if they didn't, but obviously, if there is a split between this committee and the full council, we've got to sort it out. Does anybody want to say anything else either about what I'm going to call main document or any of the smaller ones, or have any proposals for any additional policy areas that we haven't got yet?
Just to say, I totally agree with everything you're saying, to include some of the green issues is the thing that we would be keen to add. Very much behind that.
I would second that.
Yeah.
Well, there seems to be a degree of unanimity amongst us, we'll see what we can do.
Just one question on the green. After I went to a gas engineer the other day, and there is a lot that we can add, like rainwater collection, so your toilets are flushed by rainwater. There's the hot water from the solar panels. There's the solar panels for electricity. There's about four, and I presume you know these, Luke. There's about 4 things at least that you should do on a new housing estate, and we're not doing it. So I think we should be very keen that every new housing estate needs, because they can dig it up, they can do all the hard work.
Well, yes, and I suppose that in a development like the one that we've just been talking about, you know, the opportunity for sort of ground heat pumps and all the rest of it exists.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what happens when you attempt to put a ground heat pump into somewhere where there's a spring. Interesting thought.
Can I ask about where you got that document? Is it off the OCC website? The terms, not the terms of reference, the
Planning
policy.
Just kind
Is it?
Well, I got it on my computer because I drafted it, basically.
I see.
I can send you the
it has been
version.
circulated to it, well, hopefully everybody got
So,
it. copy.
yeah,
You would try it.
I found a very similar one on the website, but there were slight differences.
Right,
You
well, that's,
seem to have something that had more on it than
Right.
on the website.
in which case, perhaps we should be looking at our website
Yeah.
in due course to make sure that what we've got on the website is consistent. Or
Well,
maybe,
it's good to
maybe,
say that.
maybe all of these documents should be on the website.
2019.
Yeah, the one on the website is 2013.
Yes, exactly.
So that was iteration 1, and it doesn't look as if we ever got around to changing it, well spotted. Yeah, I suppose it's because they don't go to the website, those things, because, as I say,
We've got it.
You've got them
it should be
in
somewhere on my system. Mind you, sometimes it's not always that easy to find things again. Discussing, so the next item on the agenda, the penultimate item, we'll be pleased to hear, although there is something I do want to mention, without any other relevant matters for the report. And the observant amongst you has spotted a piece of paper in front of you.
Yes.
But this one is discuss invitation from Staunch to become part of the campaign to prevent the unsuitable and unnecessary development between Thaxton and Titchmarsh. It's on because basically the council was approached and we got this letter that said, this message comes from Staunch, it stands for Save Titchmarsh and the Upper Neem Countryside and Habitat. So we really worked hard for that. Our group are working hard to stop the 2 developments planned between Thaxton and Titchmarsh, the Gleeground site and the Castle Farm site. We're working to benefit the whole of the area, its countryside, its people and its wildlife. We're contacting you to see if you would like to become part of the campaign or prevent this unsuitable and unnecessary development from ruining the area we live in. Developers have already been in contact and working with the sites to gather information for their application. One of the developers is planning a consultation event in Titchmarsh in November. Staunch aim to have named people within the group who will be a contact point for the different villages in our region who will be affected if the planning goes ahead. We'll keep you informed of events and let you know how you can help in our aims. If you're interested in supporting our campaign, please let us know as soon as possible. And that came from Sharon Cole, who's the secretary, and I emailed her back and said, okay, we'll put it on our next planning meeting agenda. Now, I wasn't saying that we would or wouldn't support it. A, it's not for me to say. B, we may feel that we've got enough to worry about on our patch without trying to support other people. But I bring it to everybody's attention. Councillor Davis.
As good intent as it is, I think you just said it, Chair, we've got enough on our plate, and can I use the phrase, we all have to take our fair share in the area and deal with planning complaints. I wouldn't want to get involved in particular Titchmarsh, which is a bit further away. If those isolated villages got issues with town here, and I think that Titchmarsh is just a little bit too far away for us to take on any of their campaigns, because that's for them to go to NNC. If they have a coordinated response that doesn't involve Oundle, we've got our coordinated response for what we're doing. I think from different groups, I think it comes more impactful when you're taking on, if you're going to take on people like your councils, your bigger councils like NNC. That's just my personal.
Anybody have any other views, Councillor?
Well, that's unfortunately a counter view.
No.
If all they're looking for are like Oundle Town Council support us, and because I agree with the point that you're making about the it's a long way from us in terms of how many councils between us and them. But actually, if they just need people to support them, I think we should. It depends on what that support involves. If it's sort of just saying, we're behind you, fine.
Yeah, I mean, my difficulty with it is actually, as a committee, we go into these things on our own patch in considerable detail, as we just done tonight. So when we talk about it, we talk from a position of knowledge. I don't know
No idea.
anything very much about this, and in fact, I'm aware of it's going on. And I have to say, my instinct was a little bit like Paul's in the sense of, if this was Ashton or Blackpool or Protestant or something that actually is likely to impact upon us, I could see that we would make it our business to become more involved. What I'd be minded to say is that we would like to be kept informed of all developments, and would like to see any material that they can produce about what is planned and why it's wrong, and then we could perhaps further consider whether we provide any degree of practical support or otherwise to them to call them. Councillor.
Well, looks like these are developments that are yet to be given planning permission. We've had our two developments that have been given planning permission. So your answer is right, because it might be that we have some further experience being further down the line that we could use to help them, although it doesn't seem to make a difference. Well, actually it has, because they're reacting. So it might be the journey that we've taken to get to where we are would be a very useful thing for them to know, so they can prepare for it. One of the things is you have to accept it is going to happen, but then what you do about it, rather than try and waste energy fighting something that you know is going to happen anyway, or whatever. So that's my view, and I think we could support it, but remotely, as has been suggested.
Councillor Arnold firstly.
Yeah, I think just kind of coming back to Paul's point, that it depends on the level of involvement, doesn't it, within that. I think it's all well and good saying, we send a letter saying, yep, good luck, sort of thing, we support you, but, we don't know enough about it, we'd like some more information maybe, but again, it's how quickly are you going to become involved in that process, really sort of down the line. I don't know if it's.
I think the way you did it was right. The way you expressed it.
Yeah, I probably agree with that.
It occurs to me that the 605 would be involved in this to some extent.
There would certainly be an
It might
impact on
change traffic coming through
and
Arnold.
it might
It might
increase
mean that
traffic flows.
rather
certainly
like the
not bypass.
development in Corby.
Yeah.
So we probably shouldn't say, run away, you're nothing to do with us.
Oh,
And also, there's the new reshaping, isn't there? I can't remember whether we were Thrapston or not these days, under the new,
yeah,
the way that our representatives at Northampton.
They keep, they put, us- if you
Yes,
look
got
at the
them
JAG
with,
stuff,
with.
we're seen as part of the same group as Thrapston, aren't we?
Yeah, that's what I
We're put in
thought.
the same, Corby's different,
Yeah,
so it's Thrapston and Almond,
Yeah,
now
so
East
I mean,
Northants.
in a way, you could say that we've been allied into a
yeah.
new.
I mean, there's also, as you may recall, there was the Rural Coordination Group
Yes,
Yeah,
this council launched, I found myself chairing. But then NNC launched its own
it's
kind of entity that seems to be doing a not dissimilar job to the extent that the Rural Coordination Group into hibernation at the moment. But if you think about that, the idea was to kind of pool information resources and so on. So I get the impression we're not necessarily unsympathetic. You can see that there might indeed be some implications for our residents. So I would suggest that what we do is that I'll contact the lady, say we've had a discussion, say that obviously as a council that's been affected by two very major grants of outline planning permission and further significant ones still in the system, we can kind of sympathise with what they're likely to be going through, but they'll need to keep us informed about matters.
can ask for advice.
And if they think that we have any particular expertise that they might like to tap into, we're here to listen. Something along those kind of lines. So that we're not being unsupportive, but we're not committing ourselves to anything.
Yeah, I think that's
That's the middle ground.
Right. I just realised that both the last two items I've just said, I'll do X and I'll do Y. Never mind. Finally, in terms of any other relevant matters to report only,
what about the fire station?
what about the fire
We
station?
haven't discussed that.
That's.
Is that just basically putting
Yes.
something on top of the tower?
Yeah, okay, what's about the fire station? What happened was that we put together the agenda, no sooner had we partially put it together than the fire station thing arose, and no sooner had we sort of taken that on board, then the mayor came up with a suggestion, and I said, get that into the agenda, and Lisa said, it's too late. But there is something to the mayor, and I do want to talk about it briefly. But in terms of the fire station, we had this material that's been circulated to us. It was a letter sent to us on the 28th of October, so only a matter of days ago. And it looks like they are talking about a suitable site in the Oundle area for a radio base station upgrade.
It's going to be fine,
etc. I don't know.
It's
I mean,
fine.
it's come before us, but it's not strictly speaking on our agenda. It would, I suppose, particularly I'm slightly conscious of the time, whether we just want to pass this to full council and say, well, actually, maybe it's a full council issue, and then the full council wants to kick it back to us for more detailed consideration, so be it. But would people like a little bit more time to think about it and let the full council have it on their agenda and discuss it?
I'd like to. I don't think there's a lot to this at all. I think it's really simple. I think we can solve it tonight, honestly. It's just, you've got a tower, they're going to take a few masts off and replace them with some more masts.
I can see
What's the
imagine
issue?
receiving it.
It's not worth putting to full council.
Yeah, if you look at the sort of before and after
It's no different.
picture,
It's
it's
just
a
so,
thing
yes.
like that big.
Yeah.
They gone to each side. It's not.
I mean, I'm looking at this, I do have some experience of this. It's minor. I don't think people notice, they might think, what's not big.
But I suppose the letter, when you look at it, says we look forward to receiving any comments you may have on the
I don't want the
proposal."
camera to notice.
If you did want to make a comment, I suppose the comment from the sound of it, these two councillors present, would be, we're not worried by it
No.
in any way. You know,
It's not like they're building a tower. They've got
Yes,
a
it's not
tower
like
now,
we're suddenly going to get a
And they
massive tower in the centre.
and they're taking a few off them, but it's just wise. It's, I don't see it as a major issue.
Um,
And I was trying to work out the plan.
Uh,
It didn't look that much different.
I was slightly struggling with some of this material, I have to say, but I didn't spend very long looking at it.
I mean, they've done a detailed plan, but effectively, it's just, there it is, that's it.
That's,
It's before, after, doesn't
yeah,
it?
exactly,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the existing elevation.
Yeah, I think you're gonna notice a few.
That's the proposed one.
A few extra plans.
It really doesn't look very different, does it?
No.
All right, so, perhaps if we simply ask Emma on behalf of the council to acknowledge it, say it's come before our planning committee and we have no observations to make at this time.
And I think the full council, I'm gonna be happy with that. I don't think there's anybody there in the chat.
Fine. Okay, well, we won't hand it off to the next meeting, we'll say that, we'll do it that way. I'll get Emma to deal with that one instead of me. I mentioned the mayor's suggestion, and it's a sheet that's been put out in front of us all tonight, a proposal for a possible planning advisory committee. You'll note the quotes from our standing orders, which says that unless the council determines otherwise, the committee may appoint a subcommittee whose terms of reference and members shall be determined by the committee. The members of the committee may include non-councillors, unless it's a committee which regulates and controls the finances of the council. Unless the council determines otherwise, all members of an advisory committee and a subcommittee of the advisory committee could be non-councillors. And essentially what he's saying is, there is a degree of expertise out there that's kind of come out of the woodwork, partly because of sort of transition plan and things are in cycleways, and partly because of certain residents coming to the fore in connection with certain recent planning applications, shall we say. Particularly, I think of Nadine Edwards, for example, and former Councillor Robinson, in terms of the development of St Christopher's Drive. And what I'd said to Ian before I realised I couldn't actually get it onto the agenda, but I thought well, we could still kick it around in this part of the meeting, is that I would bring it here, and if we thought that there might be mileage in it, and we wanted to recommend in principle that we might want to set one up, we could then build that into the report to full council from the planning committee tonight. And then we could have this thing back on our agenda in December to look at how we want to do it, so how we want to do it. And I think that it would be to help us with some of the more community planning applications that might, in a sense, I rather hope that we maybe aren't going to get too many more of those in the next few weeks and months and years. But also perhaps looking at things like our wider planning policies and so on, maybe we could do that. But it is a departure because I can't recall us ever setting up any committee anywhere within the council quite along these lines, although there's been things like the rights of way subcommittee, which have kind of disappeared. But it's not certainly something that we've done in any kind of really mainstream way. It's certainly not anything we've ever done in the planning area. All right, yes, there are odd examples. But they tended to be exactly so. They were one-offs, whereas this looked more like a sort of standing potential subcommittee stroke advisory committee. And I just thought, well, let's float it around. Does anybody think it has merit to be explored further or not? Councillor.
I just interview with now MCAT this morning, and one of the things that I felt was, because I was a councillor in 2010, the early part of the 2010s, and now I'm a councillor in the latter part of the 2010s and the 2020s. The difference between the first time and the last, and this current time, is we're dealing with a lot more complex issues than we've had before, it seems to me. And I was talking about the fact that we're amateurs, and the reason why you've got MCAT there is to provide support for councillors. I'm in two minds about this. In one respect, it'll be great to have more eyes, expert eyes and ears on the planning that we're getting at the moment, because we have 3 major plans. With the neighbourhood plan, it would have made a difference, I think, to our methodology of how we got there and everything else. So in that respect, having access to experts is a good thing. But I'm with David on the idea of having subcommittee to planning. See, it sounds a bit awkward in some respects. So I don't see why we can't just have the names of the people that we can call upon in a less formal manner, where we can ask them the questions and get them to do it as we do with other bodies like Transition Council. So I don't know why we're having to do a committee, because we could do this informally. We have a list of names and we say, here, give us some advice on this. That's what I think.
Anybody else have a view?
I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle. Well, I mean, I quite agree. I wouldn't want them to be always there. I would like to see them as something that a little body that we could call on when there was a really big problem, not to be saying this is how you ought to have policy and things, because we're perfectly capable of doing that.
Well, it could be a case of the tail wagging the dog, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you're not careful.
Yeah.
If it was, I suppose if one did it and one set it up very much on the basis that it would meet only if this council asked it to do so on a specific area, it couldn't initiate anything of its own account. I mean, that would obviously stop Fred talking to me as chair or whoever and saying, what about? But that way we'd be kind of in control, and it might just formalise some of these discussions, which might, from the point of view of transparency and openness, not be a bad thing. In other words, rather than these being shadowy figures who have an influence on the council from beyond the council, they're people who are, in a sense, accountable to this committee. So there may be that. And it might actually, of course, potentially, I suppose, pull out to the woodwork other people of whom we are not currently aware.
Might as well something to join the council.
Or even that, conceivably. Well,
How would they deliver their opinions?
how would they deliver it?
Per paper, and
I suppose that we would ask them in any particular area to come back to us with some sort of a paper, a bit like the sort of reports that I give to this council for our planning meetings. I mean, in theory, one could say, well, rather than me spending hours doing it, we could have given the job of looking at the reserve matters on that development to our advisory committee and ask them to come up.
I think that's a very good idea. So
Sure, I'll be delighted.
but that's exactly what it is. But they have to have a meeting which is minutes.
Councillor Davies.
I think mine are very much similar in terms of sitting in the middle of it with regard to, I suppose, my mind, how would it work? It's probably a clumsy document for me, but things like keen-minded residents, I'm like, And then I start thinking, well, we'd only think, well, who are the keen-minded residents? If you're a keen-minded resident, then come and be a councillor. Come to the party and enjoy it. We've still got vacancies. Ad hoc basis, so that's the how. How does that? What does that look like? And any document, if we're going to task any group, how do we select them? In my mind, I think, well, well, actually, if we have a planning issue, say, Copstock Road, we would put that out to the town and say, look, this is what we've got. We'd like some views on a smaller group. Is anybody willing to come onto that with these sort of expertise? And then that's when we have the group do it. But then anything they produce would have to be on a without prejudice basis, because we wouldn't want it to be come back later on and be used against us in any other subsequent proceedings. I think we could find ourselves in that position. So we'd have to protect them as individuals within the town. So I'm sort of, yes, I like the idea, but on the other hand, I'm like, it's a toughie to think what that would look like moving forward. I think it needs a big debate, and I'm probably not quite sure that this is something we would solve tonight. I like the ethos of it, but there's a fair bit of work got to go into it over the months, I think, with more conversations with probably the rest of not just the planning group, but obviously the rest of the council.
That's all.
My 2 pence is I think it's a really good idea, but as Councillor Dave said, I think as long as there's very clear sort of declaration of interest from the people that are involved. So, for example, Nadine and the Ashton Road development, there's a clear, obvious declaration, a conflict of interest there. So, as long as that is made, implicit in.
As part of that narrative engagement.
Yes, then I think it's a really good idea.
I think the point is that there are some individuals who wouldn't want to come on the council
Yeah.
that have a keen interest in particularly
Specific
planning
subjects.
matters. I think that's been, to me, very obvious.
I mean, there are,
Nadine's a good example.
well, she's a good example. A different kind of example is Tony Boyle. Who
Yes,
knows our-
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, does our roads and paths. Now, I twisted Tony's arm several
So
times
I-
over the years
Yeah.
to suggest that rather than
Good
coming
point.
on, because he comes along to town meetings and he's always got something, useful to say, and he's involved in this, that and the other. But for whatever reason, he doesn't want to commit to being a councillor. But there's a resource there
Yeah.
that, we have used. I mean, it sounds like we can see some merit to the mayor's suggestion. I suggest that what we do is we ask that it goes on the agenda before council. I'll talk to it for a few minutes, even if he wants to add something. If there is a feeling that it, within full council, that it's something worth exploring, then it can come back to us. We're under no pressure to do it at all, or to do it in any particular timescale, but we can talk about it. And there might have to be an element of suck it and see. We might set something up and 6 months after we set it up, think actually this isn't working, or it isn't a help,
Give it a
or
probation period.
whatever, in which case we can drop the idea.
You can give it a probation period. can't you?
Exactly. All right, well, look, let's do that. Well, that's the two, any other relevant matters to report which we had, which kind of are both actually extra agenda items, but who's counting? Councillor Arnold, anything else?
No, thank you.
No. Davis?
No.
No.
Not surprisingly, after I talked for nothing from the hour. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Concludes tonight's meeting.
Yeah.
Well, actually,
There's a camera recording.